Well, Trent and Blackbird, thank you so much for talking to me. And Trent, you and I were just talking about how Twitter is a fun place to have a conversation, but lately, at least with the people you've been interacting with, it's become, in some respects, not as fun as it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you'll be in the middle of some great space conversation. You'll be, talking about which rockets you like or when the next launch is or some spacecraft. And things might turn, to topical things, in the media, and people lose all their sense of wonder and all their sense of good joy and happiness. And they'll reach a point where they're just, being snarky and mad at each other. And I felt that Twitter really needed some reminding that people that it's okay to just have fun. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they say what one bad apple spoils the bunch. I mean, one kind of person out there to kind of make bad comments probably proportionally has more of an effect on the entire group than a lot of really people that are more perceptive and caring about how they're actually affecting other people.
Yeah, I mean, and I've been guilty of this in the past. It's, you get to a feeling of camaraderie with people, and then you're surprised when you discover they have different values or interests to yourself. And it's hard to stay on the things we have in common because differences are just so interesting, So superheroes are very popular at the moment. I felt that if I just picked something to decorate my Twitter page with and get that jovial feeling into the conversation again, I have found that people will just not reply to something that's an invitation to go off topic or to go, dark. And I mean, it's a very difficult thing for me to do personally because I don't generally have that just stay positive attitude. I mean, I love to go dark and I love to, be grumpy. But at the same time, it doesn't result in a very happy world. And we, especially in the space community, we are here doing something that is fundamentally good, that we would all agree is fundamentally good. And if we can keep pushing that message, kind of like the Star Trek community does, it gets to the point where you can have a conversation with anyone about space things. It doesn't have to be someone from your group,
And that's one of the things that I like about this project too, is, I've been talking to old high school friends, previous coworkers, people at coffee shops, people I convinced to talk to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and just ask them, how do you see the future of humanity? And what do you think about us taking those next steps on the moon? But kind of talking about communication, it occurred to me the other day in terms of my sort of life. We used to have dial-up BBSs that we used to dial into and exchange messages. And then, the web wasn't even a thing. And we had, news servers where people would like post messages. They were completely text-based. IRC, which was like completely text-based for a long time. And then it's like the web came in, everything became a lot more easier to use, a lot more marketing. And then you have like this whole social phenomenon too. I mean, what do you think would be like the next step in terms of communication?
So I experienced all that same stuff in the text-based, 90s. And with the new Matrix movie coming out in January, I'm actually writing an article which is comparing the internet of today to the internet back then and the way it felt to be on it, that sort of thing. And I like to compare it to how old I was at that time and what someone of the same age is experiencing today. And to them, it must feel a lot more like, you know, there's monitors and there's, you know, checks and there's a lot of, you know, cops around on the internet. You know, it must feel like that to them. And, you know, to us back then, it was, we could do anything, and we often did. And, you know, but we all felt that everything we were doing was important back then. You know, every now and then, you know, we goof off all the time, but every now and then we'd stop and go, what sensible, you know, revolutionary thing can I do today? And people feel that now on the internet, and you see it on Twitter and Facebook and all the others, you know, all the time. And in many ways, that's a good thing. The question you've got to ask is that, are you making the conversation better by doing that? And is every conversation got to be about that? You know, and good things are good too. You know, like we in the space community like to talk about what we're doing, and we don't need to spray paint it on billboards because people will hear it already. You know, but understandably, there's plenty of things people talk about that it's a lot harder to get out there. It's a lot harder to get that message. And I want to be able to say, you know, to people that you can come into a conversation that's not about something that and try to change the subject, and that's fine. But don't get upset when people don't want to talk about it if, you know, you're in a space that's not for that purpose.
But I guess, have you ever read the book Quality Land? It's like,
no, I haven't.
It's about it's the same type of spirit as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it's about kind of our, you know, they have like Quality Store, which is like delivers things that you want even before you know you want them, and it's never wrong. And you know, everybody gets to have the conversations with the people they want, and they don't have to worry about anybody else. And everybody's ranking everybody. It's a really hilarious book. I highly recommend it. But
sounds good.
Yeah,
I am a ridiculously heavy reader, so you know that will get added to my, you know, reading list, and it'll probably get read in the next month or two. So, but, you know,
well, I'm part of a book club.
Backlog.
I'm part of a book club that's meeting this Saturday to discuss it. So
okay.
I just thought I'd toss that out there.
Wow, yeah, that's a challenge. It's like it's the beginning of the week. I could read a book in a week. That's not too terrible. But I never attend a book club unless I've read the book. That's the there's nothing worse than someone who's sitting at the book club who's going, I don't know what they're talking about, you know. But that's a very similar experience. You know, you'll have people who come into a you know, space video and they're just learning, and you'll get to have a, you know, good discussion with them. But other times you want to have a discussion with, you know, your space peeps who understand what you understand already, and you don't have to go back over that detail. And I reckon that's good too. You know, I think that's a reasonable, you know, thing to do on the internet. And you shouldn't have to put up too many gateways. You shouldn't have to, you know, fight the algorithms that want to make your interesting content available to people who aren't interested and are going to respond to it in a different way. But at the same time, you don't want people to form little bubbles and believe things that are outside the scope of everybody else who's experiencing it. I think there's a strong case for, when it comes to space stuff, that we try to achieve a mainstream appeal, a wide stream appeal. And if you want to know how to do that, just look at Star Trek. We've gone from what was once a very niche product that didn't even make it, like the ratings didn't even make it for the original series. It was only in syndication that it got picked up, you know, and that building of a community of people that will espouse why you should watch the show, you know. And I think the same with all of the things that that are happening now in commercial spaceflight. And Jeff Bezos sending everyone and then their son up to space, that is more and more getting into the mainstream consciousness that rich people go to space, right? And whenever that topic comes up, there is a certain amount of normal axe grinding, and that's understandable. But then there's also people who are like, I'm happy to explain to you why this is happening, and there's other people who aren't, and I think that we need some sort of indication when these things happen, who's willing to answer your questions when you don't know anything, and who's just there to enjoy their 60th launch that they've watched,
And who just learned something is anxious to share it with the other people who might appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it's like we almost need labels or something. It's like, I'm in my moment, just let me be, or,
Yeah,
ask me.
Well, this is the thing is when you look at other communities, they very much label themselves, and they provide, signals to people to indicate who they are and what their purpose is, right? And I think most of us, when we use social media, we might do one or two of these things, but we're like, okay, I've done enough. I've done two things, and now people are treating me close to the way I want. And, only now and then do I have any conflict with anybody. But really, you get to choose these symbols. You get to decorate your social media however you want. And people really do treat you differently depending on those signals. So it's a hard skill to learn, especially if you're not creatively oriented, which is a lot of people. And I think that it's a skill that we need to teach.
And it's one thing to label yourself as being like always the person willing to answer or the person that doesn't want to, but you also have another aspect of mood as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes people aren't static.
Yep. Things. Yeah, you can change that stuff. You can throw that stuff up, and it's in a normal conversation, in a real world conversation, you would introduce yourself, you would say who you are, and you get to, in that moment, sort of define your thoughts and feelings and reactions to what's going on. Whereas on social media, you just pop up. It's just you're the head stuck in the window of somebody who was enjoying an activity, and you're often not sure what your interactions is going to be when you start interacting with somebody. So and when it goes bad, it's usually you have no idea how it happened. It's like some word that you used is actually a signal to them, and they get upset that you're using their signal without understanding what it means to them. And when that happens, you either have the choice of learning why this person is upset, which generally nobody does, or just mute and block them, or ignore them. And that's what most people do. And so the end result is we're progressing towards a situation where we just don't hear what we don't want to hear, and we don't bother trying to understand who other people are, what their concerns are, what their feelings, thoughts. It's like, I don't care, you're just text on a screen. And so we end up with zero empathy in the world. And I don't think that's a world we want to live in.
Yeah, and I guess you maybe see that spill over into other aspects of life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a reason why people are directed not to spend their lives on social media, and it does have a negative effect on their relationships in the real world. I have friends that are extremely religious and dedicated to their family, and they'll be on social media for a few days, and you'll see the point where they just go, look, I just can't do this anymore. Like, it's having a negative effect on my family life. And they'll disappear for 2 weeks, and then they'll come back, and it's like, an addict returning to get their hit. And it's like that experience that you're having, that you're finding so enticing but toxic, can be changed just by changing your perception of what is actually going on. You know, the hit for many people comes from they're starting to engage with lots of people, they're starting to feel understood, and then they hit that point where the understanding is incomplete, or someone new comes into the picture that makes them feel now that all of the previous understanding they've received wasn't actually genuine, right? And, you know, to a certain extent, that's true, because really we are just building this in our own heads. You know, and all of this, you know, the communication with other people happens in the minds of the people who are participating in it. And we can construct any world we want. Unfortunately, that also means we can construct, you know, things that we enjoy that don't actually reflect the full picture.
And have you developed like some good online friendships?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in the space community, and you know, I've developed and grown as a person from those interactions with people in the space community. You know, like, for example, I used to be a massive artificial gravity advocate, right? And I was of the opinion that we need a station in Leo to spin up and, you know, develop whether or not we can live on Mars, for example. And then, of course, I was like, well, on the way to Mars, you're going to want artificial gravity as well. And you know, when you get there, you probably want to spend a lot of time in orbit before you go down to the surface. You know, I had all of these thoughts and opinions, and I would tell anyone who listened what these things were. And one day, my friend described to me the research that had been done on the International Space Station in regards to bone wasting and some of the progress that had been made there. And after, you know, talking with them and looking at the data myself, I actually changed my mind. You know, I like changed my opinion and said, you know, I now don't think that we need in transit to Mars or anywhere else, actually, but, you know, in particular to Mars. We don't need that in transit artificial gravity, I don't think. Astronauts can get there in good enough condition. You also don't need to stay in orbit around Mars for long. You can land directly. And that surface time of recovery doesn't have to be short. You know, you could sit on the surface of Mars for 2 weeks and before you actually did the first EVA. You know, whereas we're sort of programmed by the moon landings to think that, like, the minute you land on the surface, you want to get out and walk on the surface. And if you're spending 6 months, you know, in zero G, when you land on the surface of Mars, you're not going to immediately get out and walk on the surface because you're probably not going to have the legs for it, right? So you need to be prepared when you land, but at the same time, you don't need to be immediately prepared. You know, and that sort of change of opinion, you know, that sort of like interaction where you go, no, actually, you're right. You know, I thought I was right, but now I think you're right. You know, and then someone else comes along and explains it differently, and you go, okay, I still think he's right, but I understand where your point of view is. You know, and you can have a constructive conversation about these things. But that sort of give and take took years to develop. And I would rather that be able to be the immediate and assumed situation between space cadets. You know, it's, and I think that is the case mostly in the Star Trek community, for example, where there's a presumption of positive intent, and people generally, you know, when they don't receive that positive intent, they're more surprised than they are annoyed, and they'll usually try to, like, you know, educate first or tone down first before they re-engage, which is reasonable. Of course, we all snarkily quote tweet things that we think are, you know, hilariously off base for the brand, and whereas in the space community in general, I think that we've gotten sick of that. We've gotten sick of just the snarky responses, and now we're sort of like, well, what what is it that we're doing? What is the space community about?
Do you think we're going to be better communicators in the future, about the same, or worse than we are now?
I think it really comes down to like whether or not our space communities become more insular and combative with the mainstream. And I think SpaceX goes in that direction a bit too far. Or if we become, actually, and this is like the ideal, is to become something that we're in agreement that it's worthwhile in general for humanity to do what we're doing, and to keep trying to get that message out to the public, and have the public sort of like, they don't have to accept it right away, but if you hear something enough times, you start to go, well, I can tell you why other people believe that, but I don't. And once you reach that level where people who who aren't invested in the dream of going to space and settling space or any of those things can explain to a third party why other people believe this stuff, then you're now on the path to them accepting that truth too, and that's the way it grows. Is you always got to have like people who are into it but not terribly into it be able to explain to the people who are totally not into it what it is that these true believers are actually talking about. And I've tried to take that role myself a few times, and it's very difficult to do. It can be hard to set aside your own objections that you have in your head to explain what somebody else thinks. And I think we're getting better at it. And the more it happens, the less snark actually comes out.
It's a difficult thing to probe with an open mind something that somebody else is saying that you believe is completely wrong, without either feeling like you're somehow denying what you think, or somehow maybe making fun of the person in some weird way.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is we're sort of trained to explain other people's opinions with snark or with like mocking us on top of it, right? Because it's a defense mechanism. You're trying to say to someone that you're explaining it to, these are the beliefs that these other people have, and I want to be respectful of their beliefs, but I want you to know that these aren't my beliefs, right? So what you're doing there is signaling to the other person while you're talking. And we have all these innate ways that we learn how to do that, especially if you go to the bar and talk to someone over a beer. It's very common to say, hey, I want to talk to you about this thing that I heard other people believe. What do you think about it? And on social media we can do the same things. We just gotta understand what our signals mean to people and what their signals mean to them, and being able to put together a good package of signals to say, this is my intention, right? And you never have to explain it, because they just see all of these icons and links and profile pictures and all of that sort of stuff. They see it and they go, oh, this person is speaking from a third person perspective on this topic. And when you've got those signals set up, you can talk about anything. You can talk about people's cherished beliefs and have them say, oh yeah, you did a good job for someone who isn't one of me.
Now, through this set of interviews, I've talked to two people who are Apollo deniers.
Oh yes.
And I'm wondering what your approach would be in terms of interacting.
My father-in-law many years ago was a Apollo denier, and I approached it in the normal way that space geeks approach it, in that I got upset and suggested he educate himself and told him the books to read, and at the end of the day, none of that worked, of course. So instead, I sort of shut down and would just not mention space or not talk about any of these things. And that got to the point where it was like, well, now I just don't want to talk to my father-in-law, you know? So the thing that I found eventually worked was I would mention something about, you know, the Apollo program or the moon or something like that, get him going, let him get on his rant, and just wait until he asks for a fact. And at that point, you know, I would say, oh yeah, you know, this is what, for example, he asked, how did they get those rovers up there? You know, they're so big. There's like whole cars. They couldn't have got them up there. And so I went, oh, I can show you if you like. Would you like me to show you? He's like, sure. And I pulled up a documentary on, you know, the Discovery Channel or something like that he had access to. And I knew just basically where in the show I could skip to. And I skipped to like Apollo, oh God, I don't know, it was like the 1971 one or something like that. And I skipped to that, and that you could see the actual the folded up wheels on the rover and sticking on the side of the capsule. And thankfully they put a person in the shot, so you had a good idea of the scale. And I showed it to him, and he went, oh my God, I had no idea that the capsule was that big, right? His thought process was that the lander was actually just like a phone booth, right? And inside, yeah, it kind of is just like a phone booth, right? But the outside of that thing is so big that he never had an idea in his head of how the astronauts had to come down a ladder. And, you know, because when you watch those old video pictures, they're not very descriptive. You can't really see, you know, where they get out, how they come down, and how far it is. And if you look at like the original Apollo 11 landing, the video is so poor. I mean, it's amazing for the time, but it's so poor that people just generally were like watching a blur on the screen. They never had any idea of what they were seeing. So once he saw that, he was just like, oh, okay, well, that's obvious how they could get that up there. And there, every now and then he would still try to get a rise out of me by saying, you know, some Apollo moon landing fake stuff. But you could tell his heart had gone out of it. You know, he'd been engaged once in a non-aggressive way, and he'd gone, okay, there's more for me to learn here. I know how to learn it now. Until I do, I won't open my mouth again, you know. And then once that passes, it's like, well, now I can just play with the feelings that comes from someone when I talk about it. And I don't imagine that he's you know, being annoying as he once was. But you know, many times we all have the same reaction. We all have a little information, as they say. A little information is a dangerous thing. We all have a little information about a lot of topics, you know. And when people build narratives on that poor understanding, it's not surprising that they end up in strange places, you know. And so, and of course, the false narrative often sells better than the real narrative.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Several things. One is like the video quality was the aspect of the first moon landings that both of the people I talked to pointed to as being sort of their evidence that it didn't happen. They felt like it was just too poor quality. Like, how could they possibly? And both of these people were alive during the time. You know, they
Right.
They were, you know, in their 60s. So they were, you know, teenagers when it happened.
Right.
So it's kind of,
maybe they never looked at it again since then. You know, like it's so many. Like every time it came back on the news or something, they just went, "Yeah, I've seen it." Yeah. I know a lot of people I've spoken to in the public who don't, like, they didn't even know that there was more missions after Apollo 11. And they didn't know that, Apollo 10 went to the moon. And I like to talk to them about Apollo 8, and they go, okay, I had no idea that even happened. And then once I explained to them that, there was no lander on that mission, they went, I don't even know, what do you mean the lander? And you explain how it's two parts, it's like there's the capsule and there's the command module and there's a lander, and they're like, why? And then you get to explain, how you can make something out of tinfoil that will land on the moon, and all of a sudden they go, oh well, actually that's amazingly interesting. It's how is that safe? Well, it kind of isn't. It's a risk. And you can explain concepts of risk and just how insane it was in the 60s to attempt what even today we would consider a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. And I feel like in the 60s, I wasn't alive in the 60s.
Well, neither was I.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like, and maybe this is just because I'm in the space community, that the vast majority of people knew we were going to the moon. Like, it was in the national consciousness. I mean, whenever we landed on the moon, it made it on the front of every newspaper and magazine and was in the TV. So I feel like it was well known.
It was well known, but a lot of people still didn't care. I just watched Get Back, the documentary about the Beatles in 1969 doing the Black Album, and it was my father's era, as he's English, and in London at the time, he was excited when he heard this thing going on, and like rushed to be down there, but he missed all of it. So, and he'd actually known the Beatles when he was a kid, right? And I said to him, because it was 1969, I said to him, what did you think of the moon landing? And he was like, didn't watch it, didn't care, and when he read it in the newspaper the next day, he just glanced at it and then turned the page. It's like, to him, the exciting thing that was happening in the 60s was the music, and everything else was just tuned out. It was like, there was a war going on, don't care, like just blank it out, don't think about it. All the politics stuff that was going on, the rise of white nationalism, all of these things in the UK, he was like, I don't want to know about any of these things, right? And a lot of us are like that today. It's like, I like the three things that I like. I follow those things on the social media. And when something comes into my world that interferes with those things, I'm just going to like deny it or get rid of it. And to a lot of people who are very focused on what's wrong with Earth and how we can fix it, how we can make our society better, and how we can make, in general, a paradise on Earth, the thought of space just seems like a cop-out. It seems like, well, you just want to run away from where we are. And I can understand that. I can understand where that perspective comes from. My thought process is that we need to have both. Like the Star Trek way, we need to have a paradise on Earth and a future for humanity in space. Without both of those things, we can't have the other. We need to tell the world how we're going to make Earth a better place, and we need to explain that there's going to be a new frontier, so that people who really are focused on what they can do with their life don't feel like they have only one choice, which is to dedicate it to making everything better. Because sometimes you've got to have you've got to have aspirations before you can think about how you can improve your life. Like, why bother making Earth better if it's just all going to go away anyway? There's a big common thread running through a lot of everything that happens today, is that we'll explain how something good is happening, but we'll say, you know, of course, none of that really matters because of climate change, or because a good one that's a nice crossover recently is, you know, the asteroid redirect mission. It's like, what happens if we you know, get hit by an asteroid? Well, all of this hard work that we put into on Earth is gone. And it's like, well, if we had a dream of going out into space and eventually to the stars, and I really think that it's important to say, you know, we're not just going to Mars, we're going in everywhere. Right? We're going out to many, many planets, to many, many star systems. And we have no idea how to do that, of course. But a few years ago, probably only 10 years ago, in fact, we had no real idea how to go to Mars. You know, and now we have a good idea how to go to Mars, but we have no real idea what to do when we get there. And everyone has, you'll find 100 different ideas of what to do once we get to Mars. And none of that is crystallized into a single or a few options yet. We're still in the phase of, can it even be done? And I think that's our future. We're going to change from can it be done to it's going to be done. Here's how it's going to be done. And once people have that realism to cling to, I think that it'll actually have a great benefit to Earth. It'll have a great benefit to our society.
Yeah, those are very good points. You know, I find a lot of people don't know that Jeff Bezos talks about trying to move heavy industry and all these earth harming things into space and making Earth a paradise. And I've kind of seen lots of reactions to that. People are like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. Or, you know, then, oh, that'll never happen, or be too far out into the future. And I've also seen on Twitter and other places a completely interesting reaction of, well, that's great. A rich man just wants to turn Earth into his private park. You know, it's just like, just all over the board.
It is. And I mean, a lot of those replies are just reactions, right? Like when someone says, you know, they can't visualize it. That's what the problem is that you when you say a very short thing, like, for example, Elon's, I want to expand the consciousness of humanity, you know, off Earth so that we can preserve that consciousness, that spark. When he says that to us, space geeks, he's triggering a whole bunch of signals that we have. You know, he's saying, you know what I'm talking about when I say this, right? Other people see that and go, oh yeah, that's that weed smoking guy, you know? And it's like, that's all they know about Elon, that one thing that he went on a popular show and did. And so when they read that, they get completely different signals, right? They get like, all right, he's just, you know, talking about his dreams and none of it's real, you know? Whereas you and I know that Elon 100% believes that and wants to go and do it. Whereas to other people, they go, it must be a trick, you know? He must want something else, and this is his way of getting it. You know? And that's just a normal way that humans react to this sort of stuff. You know, so when Jeff Bezos talks about his dreams for the future, we have multiple reactions, but people will have a common reaction of just like, well, yeah, but you're just getting money from rich people, right? Like, and that's certainly true, right? Jeff is a very rich guy. He didn't get that rich by writing checks, right? He didn't get that rich by paying for things out of his own pocket. He knows that in order to do the things that he wants to do in space, he needs to build up a lot of like treasure chest, you know, and then spend that in a sensible way. And I think if he was trying to do all the things that he wants to do right now, that he wouldn't have a chance of doing them, right? But if he's successful in getting the mainstream of society to see going to space as a normal thing, which I think is a goal, then at some point suggesting that there's a permanent place where you can go in space, you know, just a normal person to go in space, like a space station or something like that, people will just go, hey, of course there is, like the 5-minute rides are not the end of the game for him. They're just the very, very beginning. But mostly it's about changing public perception.
And, we talked before about bubbles and about, the 1960s, even though people weren't interested, they knew about it. When I go up to people in Starbucks on the street at the mall, and I'm like, hey, did you know that NASA's planning to send people to the moon again? About 80% of them have no clue. Some of them think that NASA's been shut down and, we stopped going to space. Some of them think that's where the astronauts have always gone. Like, where else would they go? Yeah. And some think, NASA's purposely trying to keep it a secret, which is kind of funny if you look at their social media, which whenever I ask them about how should they get the word out, they're like, oh, social media. But I mean, NASA does a lot on social media, but it doesn't make it beyond that, that tangential bubble. I guess it sounds like it probably doesn't surprise you that so few people know. But I guess the other question is it important? Does it matter? Is it something that needs to be addressed?
Okay, so there's multiple issues there in that usually people don't hear things directly from NASA unless they're a space geek. The exception is if it's in a newspaper or it's in an online place that's mainstream, in which case people will glance at it and then move on to the next article, right? Because it's NASA. It's like, okay, that's nice. There's a bit of a aversion to that for most people because they know that there's going to be at least something they don't understand. And so it's like, well, what's the point of reading it? I'm not going to understand it anyway, But the other thing is that usually what people get excited about things, they hear it from other people who are excited about it, right? So they're like, I don't understand why you're excited. I want to be excited too, tell me about it. And for NASA, that well's sort of been poisoned over the years in that every time we get excited about something, it gets canceled. Every time we get excited about something, it turns out to be something different, or we get excited about it and then we have to explain what it means, and it's a burden. So you keep your mouth shut and then you don't have to explain it to everybody, and all of those things boil down to how can we better explain what it is that we're feeling and why we feel it. And that's a skill most of us don't really have. But it's a skill you can learn. And a good way to learn that skill is to make sure that people don't find you confronting, but they don't find you over friendly either. Very important. And that you don't have any agenda, very often content creators are understandably just trying to get people to look at their stuff, and when you get to the point where you're talking to somebody and they sort of go, okay, anyway, watch this video, it has that effect of, well, I guess you weren't really interested in talking to me, and that can have a negative effect on people's willingness to engage with the kind of things that we want them to engage with. So I don't think it's that NASA has to communicate better. I think NASA does great at communicating to kids because they're interested in everything all of the time. They haven't learned that that life is terrible yet, right? So they're fine with it. Adults, they're generally not great. They're sort of like, they'll give you a really quick soundbite because they know that's all as an adult you'll listen to, right? Is that little tiny bit of information. And it's sort of the rest of filling that gap, trying to get an adult to look at it through kids' eyes is so far, between those two those two extremes, that you really need enthusiasts to fill the gap. And that means that if we want people to think differently about what we find and cherish and enjoy, then we have to present it in a way that gets them to look in deeper on their own. You know, I'm of the opinion that you should never redirect anyone to resources until they're just desperately ready for knowledge. You know, they're just like, look, I just want to understand now. And you go, cool, well, this would help you understand and this would help you understand, but I'm happy to answer your questions, you know. And it's better when you have a community that can answer those questions so that you're not taking on all the burden yourself.
And, you know, sometimes like the best teacher at school is not necessarily the best teacher for everybody. It's who you can connect with. And, you know, we might all connect differently to different enthusiasts, like the way the words you use.
Yeah, absolutely.
You
Yeah,
know,
I follow quite a lot of, you know, space people on YouTube and Twitter and all that sort of stuff as well. But like, I find, you know, some Everyday Astronaut, for example, I find very interesting and fun to talk to. But Tim is incredibly into the things that he's into sometimes. And it's sort of like, okay, even me as a giant space geek, you lose me when you start talking about stage combustion engines in Russia and the different codes and numbers of things. It's like, I used to be totally into all of that information. And now it's sort of like, okay, if I wanted to do a course on rocketry, Russian rocketry, I know where it is, right? Like, I can go do that now. Someone asks me about what is this stage combustion thing, I can go, here's more information than you will ever want. So I wait until somebody asks that question before I direct them to that video. I would never say to my mum or, you know, someone at the pub, hey, you know, you should watch this mega geeky video, unless I wanted them to understand that passion goes beyond what they have passion for. You know?
That's a very good point. And even Tim, he's not into everything either. I noticed some kind of bristling emails from him, not emails, but tweets about covering space news. He's like, I've never covered space news. I am into deep research and understanding deeply on these things. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool, actually.
yeah, absolutely. And it's good to have, you know, like, we are so spoiled, you know, we have so many great, you know, space interaction, you know, engagement people, you know, and we can actually say to people, you know, this is someone that I admire, you know, you might be interested in them. But what we've got to make sure we don't do is just say to people, look, just watch all this stuff and you'll get into it, because that's not usually the case. You need someone to connect to who you are and what you like and believe in before you'll get interested in any of this stuff, you know. So a good thing that you might explain to someone is that what Elon wants to do on Mars in his head seems to be like, you know, a Star Trek episode to him. You know, it's like, we're gonna do this massive thing. We don't have a fantastic, you know, transporters and spaceships, so we're gonna have to do a different thing. But once we get there, it'll be just this, you know, don't want to say utopia, but it'll be this working place where people will all be professional and there'll be no conflict, you know. And I used to try to engage people by suggesting that was, you know, not dark enough, because we prefer, in general, our society prefers to hear the bad side of things, right? And I tried to encourage that sort of get interested enough to go and look something up, right? And then once they've done that, it's sort of, you've captured them, and now they're ready to learn, right? But I decided my method was just not positive enough. I had to come up with something different that was, can I somehow engage people in a way that makes them just curious without, making them depressed. and I can't say it works better, but it certainly puts people in the right frame of mind when they go looking for these things. So
yeah, I've often wondered about it. Who's going to take starships to Mars, because that is not going to be fun. Even Gwen Shotwell says, it's going to be like camping, and I don't like camping, so I'm going to stay right here. But the same sort of question was asked about Europeans coming to North America in like the 1400s, 1500s. And one of the reasons that has come up that people talk about is like religious freedom. And not religious freedom as in like you should be free to practice your religion, but rather we as a group should be free to impose our own religion on our group in a completely isolated way. And, you got to think Mars will be wonderful for groups of people who are like, we don't like the way that, there's kind of like this global medium melting pot type thing. And we really want to have a distinctive identity with distinctive boundaries and a distinctive in and out group with, able to enforce living the way that we think life should be lived, which a lot of those Martian colonies may be very horrific for people here on Earth living in our times.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at like frontier towns and the great settlement of the West, and these are all American examples, but there's plenty of other great examples in other cultures as well. That has been the primary reason why people start a town. They found a town because they want a place to raise their kids the way they want to raise their kids. That said, I'm of the opinion that Mars is going to remain, a drill site for a very long time. It's going to be an industrial place, and the main reason why people, or pretty much the only reason why people go there, will be because they're getting paid to do it. And I mean, what a great adventure. I mean, imagine you're 19, you just finished you're 20, you just, whatever it is these days, you just finished your engineering degree, and or you're in the last year of your engineering degree, and you had the option of getting on a rocket, going to Mars, and doing some job, like you're overwatching machines drilling holes, or you're overwatching the construction of giant tents on the surface, or whatever it is that you're working on, whatever shape or form. We don't know yet what shape or form this technology will take, and that's interesting in itself. But you do that for maybe a year, and whatever the sonnet is, and you would get back on the rocket and go back, and then you sort of like at the end of that experience, you would go, okay, do I want to go back, right? That'd be the ultimate question. And I from experience can say that when you get a free trip to somewhere, it's very hard to get the next free trip, and then, but I think there will be people who, from very early in their career, they will go off planet, and then they will get another opportunity to go off planet, and another, until they reach their lifetime limit, as if we're still doing that sort of radiation problem. But I think all of that will go away very soon. It will get to the point where we can mitigate it sufficiently with drugs and shielding. And then you'll get to the point where it's like, okay, well, now it's not unusual to meet a 20-something-year-old who's been to Mars twice, and to think about that now is more reasonable than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, someone you said that, and they go, yeah, I have read sci-fi books like that. Whereas now it's sort of like, come on, you know? And then in another 10 years, it'll be like, well, of course, yeah, that's not strange at all. And that makes for a mental model in people's heads. They see space as the place where engineers go to become fantastic engineers, right? And anyone who doesn't have some space on their resume, probably doesn't work in the space industry. They've probably, if they've taken some sort of ground-based thing, it's generally they've decided to take a second seat, and not step forward and be like one of the first people to go and create this new frontier. And it to me, it sounds like a wonderful place to live. And at that point, once all of the technical problems have been solved and they're all sort of like, sitting there on the shelf, and people have ideas of how to improve it, but it's like 5-10%, on the margin improvements on those things. I mean, improvement on everything continues so long as people think it needs to be better, right? But once you've got all of those solved things, then you can imagine people saying, hey, I would like to start my own Mars colony, or go to an asteroid, or go, dig a gigantic hole on the moon and build a base inside of that or something. Whatever it is that people decide to do, they can just look up how much it will cost and go, okay, this is a very good estimate of how much this thing will cost. Can I raise that much money? And once things are I just need to raise money for it. We have all of these crazy mechanisms to get people to part with their cash to do amazing things now. And I think that's where the direction in which we're going.
It's going to be an exciting time. You mentioned earlier about one reason people don't pay attention to space things and NASA things is because they keep changing. We put this big announcement, we're going to do this thing, and then it gets delayed, it gets canceled. And the former NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, used to say it was like Lucy and the football and like Peanuts, and that, this time we're going to really make it. And he was really pushing that 2024 date. And it really looked like there's a lot of steam that was created. And, over the past 6 months, 8 months, it seems like that steam kind of gotten deflated a little bit with, OIG reports saying spacesuits aren't going to be ready in time, forget about 2024. Bill Nelson coming out, the current NASA administrator, and saying, it's going to be 2024, we'll go around the moon. We probably won't land into 2025. OIG coming back and one-upping him, saying, well, it's probably going to be 2026, 2027 or later. Issues with the SLS. Read something that Eric Berger had put out there today about, one of the controllers for one of the four, rocket motor, engines on the bottom of the SLS apparently isn't working for Artemis 1 or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. How are you feeling about us going back to the moon?
I'm actually, the big thing that got to me was Elon was talking about in his update about the rocket. I always find it interesting. The rest of that webcast was just terrifying to people who don't know anything about space or the place of Earth in, the precariousness of Earth. But in amongst all of that stuff, that very rich interaction, we saw Elon say, look, Mars is a while away now. Mars is pretty far off, but I think we can get to the moon soon and, build a big base there and all of this sort of thing, that sort of response. And to me, I thought that was like personal growth on Elon's part. It was like he's actually sort of gotten to the point now where he's thought so much about what's coming next, which means he thinks that spaceship is ready, right? So he's thinking now about the application of it, and his focus is on the moon because NASA's focus is on the moon, right? And so if we do have a chop and change, that's not the end of the world, because it's like if we redirect back to Mars, then maybe we'll bypass the moon, right? That sounds bad from a interaction point of view, and I don't want that to happen. I would prefer that we stay, NASA stay focused on the moon, and that SpaceX support that mission, right? But when I got that response, I was like, okay, now I can see how SpaceX will actually become a driver for SLS and Orion and whatever lander we end up with now, which is not 100% obvious, right? Like, I certainly can see Starship landing on the moon, delivering phenomenal amounts of cargo, possibly even launching from the Earth and landing on the moon with crew. I could see all that. What I don't see is spaceship docking with the gateway and then being the ferry down to the surface. It's so absurd, but maybe, hard to see the future is. I hope this was useful. I do have to go. I'm actually 15 minutes late already. Yeah. So
terribly sorry about that. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And see you online.
Later. Bye.